It's a real pleasure to have a chance to introduce you to Dayton Castleton, which I will in just a moment. But I first also want to just say a quick thank you to the CITL for the collaboration in this event. Dayton is here. I invited him here to engage with honor students, but it's wonderful to sort of overlap the conversations on campus. You know what I mean? And to bring people in to a variety of different venues and talk the same talk together. So anyway, thank you to the CITL for the collaboration on this. Really appreciative of it. Dayton Castleton. I asked Dayton how I should introduce him. I asked could I read his bio from his website. He said, well, you could, if you think that'll give me credibility. Or you could just do it informally. So do it just a little bit more informally and tell you I've known Dayton for around 7 years now. We were colleagues at a former institution in Chicago, at which Dayton was a professor of art. Dayton currently lives in Bentonville, Arkansas, where he directs the 21C Museum. But he's also really, I've learned, invested in sort of the public art conversation and scene there. Your name is on a lot of different boards and initiatives. And so he's somebody who has thought deeply about art as a scholar of art, as a practitioner of art, also as a person who's thought about art and its role in the community, in particular, his own way of thinking about art as one way that Christians can participate in what God is doing in the world. And so that I want to introduce him to you as sort of all those things, because I think what you'll notice as you get to talk to him and ask him questions today is that he can sort of easily step back and forth between these very technical worlds and these theological worlds and these very practice community-focused worlds. And he's just the kind of person that is worth having a conversation with. So welcome him with me. I'll turn it over to you, Dayton.
I do want to thank Aaron. We joked yesterday eating dinner in the cafeteria that it took us 7 years to finally make that dinner in the cafeteria appointment. Our orbits didn't often cross at Trinity, but it's been really nice for them to cross here again. I want to try to frame this. It's difficult for me to miss the imagination that went into this room when I walked in. The little paint splotch representations, the paint chip holders for the utensils, even all of these little sticks coming out of the centerpieces with animal hair stuck to the end of them. You know, they're interesting sticks. They look like they might be useful for something. I love it because it is an imaginative way of bringing us into a space where you know that an artist is coming, and this artist is going to talk about art. And we all have certain ideas when we hear the word art. Well, what is art? Something pops into our head, some conception. And for most people, and for many people, the thing that comes to mind is this one particular branch of image making that's realized by taking cotton fibers and stretching them around a wooden frame and taking animal hair and sticking it on the stick and then grinding up minerals and elements and mixing them with an oily goo and then smushing them around until they look like things. And that's a lot of people's sort of baseline conception of what art is, and it's reflected in the room that an artist is coming, so we should make it look arty. And that means brushes and paint splotches and things of this sort. But that's a very sort of narrow understanding in one sense of what art is. I appreciate it, but I just want to point out that what I'm going to say today is probably going to be so far afield of that it might seem jarring, and it might even perhaps not be what you expected. But the one thing that I'm convinced of is that there's a lot of overlap between every single person's discipline in here and what I'm going to say. There's a specific and interesting overlap between the discipline of engineering, invention, really. I was looking at the ingenuare or something, the Latin root for it basically means a kind of trickery and invention, the ability to play well, in one sense, is what you could say. So it's definitely going to overlap with that in a significant way. And I'm not just shoehorning that in there. It really is well reflected in what I do as an artist, and so that makes a lot of sense. But what I'm really more interested in is that impulse to make things. What is that all about? The question I got asked last night, that was the most interesting question to me by one of the honor students that was here, was how do you create meaning in your art? How do you create meaning in your art? This was the question that this young student asked me. And I responded in a kind of, it took me a little while, I think, to get going, and I had to ramble around a little bit to get around to where I wanted to be. But I think I should have responded by saying, how do you create meaning in your engineering? How do you create meaning in your engineering? To turn the question around, how do you create meaning in your teaching? How do we create meaning at all? Do we create meaning? Is maybe the question that it's getting to. Is it meaningful to plow a row in some soil? Is it meaningful to plow a row in some soil? Is it more meaningful to plow a row in some soil in Africa? How do I create meaning when I do a drawing? Do I create meaning by drawing a tree? Or do I create meaning by drawing Jesus? Or do I create meaning by drawing a line? Those are some of the, I think, the extension. Where does meaning begin, if you're going to ask that question? How do you create meaning in engineering? And how do you create meaning in a PowerPoint presentation? In other words, here's a form. How do you make something like this? How do you make a presentation or something like this a meaningful experience and not just a boring lunchtime experience, or not just a sort of esoteric lunchtime experience, but something that's applicable or interesting or something like that? And so, I've got this PowerPoint presentation, but I also have a little notebook. It's my moleskin compendium of everything that I need to write down or think about. I have the Bible. I have a little word search that Aaron and I tore out of a word search that was in the chaplain's apartment today, very providentially in a certain sense. And I've got the PowerPoint. I've got all these different components. But what I'm really interested in is, even so, how do you make meaning out of it? Where does meaning reside, or how does it come about? I want to read a little bit of a poem here. I think one of the first email responses when Aaron said, I want you to come speak at Laterno, and I want you to think about theology and art and the things that you do, but I'm interested in how you might explore that in relation to engineering, because it's this engineering heavy school. And I replied back to him with I included this short stanza of a poem by Rudyard Kipling called McAndrew's Hymn. Are any of you guys familiar with that poem? Here's the first stanza of McAndrew's Hymn. Lord, thou hast made this world below the shadow of a dream, and taught by time, I take it so, accepting always steam. From coupler flange to spindle guide, I see thy hand, O God, predestination in the stride, O yon connecting rod. John Calvin might have forged the same, enormous, certain, slow. I, rotted in the furnace flame, my institutio. Institutio, of course, is a reference to Calvin's institutes. McAndrew is obviously Scottish. He's obviously Scotch Presbyterian. He's obviously a Calvinist. And so he frames it in that way. But I think what's most important here is that this man whose work and job and charge is to keep a big engine running as it traces the path between England and Fiji, making a stop in India along the way. And this is when Kipling got to know the engineer that he bases McAndrew's Hymn off of. His job is simply to keep the ship going, to transport the people to the British colonies. But in the midst of his job, in the midst of not the good that he does by transporting people to, et cetera, expanding the empire, all the other sort of results of something like that, the thing that he focuses on here, the place where he finds his calling and his substantiation, is in steam from coupler flange to spindle guide, in the stride of the connecting rod. And so that, in a certain sense, you have to ask the question again, how do you create meaning in a steam engine? Well, in a way, I think when it works right. This is a photograph of me. I was in my third year teaching at Trinity Christian College, but I've been a bike mechanic since I was a freshman in college in 1993. That was how I kind of made my way through college, and I love the way bicycles work. I love the parts. I love the symmetry of the whole thing. I love the simplicity. I think it's the most beautiful machine perhaps ever made in its simplicity and what it can do, and the myriad of different things that it can do with these, very small reconfigurations of parts. I love bicycles, and so even while I was teaching as a college professor, I spent one summer and worked part-time in a bike shop just because I like to work on bikes. I don't want to do it all the time, but I like to work on bikes. Psalm 8, Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You set your glory in the heavens. Skipping ahead. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them? You have crowned them with glory and honor. You made them rulers over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet. Bicycles, steam engines, etc. Romans 1, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. It is the world that is made, and it is the world that is seen, that God's invisible qualities are understood by us. This is very clear in what Paul says. And then there's this quoting, it's just a phrase, but from a film that I saw. You can glorify God by peeling a spud if you peel it to perfection. And I think that's true. There's something noble in the way that we work and act within the world. So how do you create meaning in peeling a spud? Etc. Well, I like to start at the beginning. A very good place to start, as Maria von Trapp said. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. In the beginning, God. And I think that is perhaps the most important phrase in Scripture. In the beginning, God, that before anything, God was there. God existed. The earth was formless and empty. It was void, as one of the translations is. It was not, in one sense. The only reason it was, in a certain sense, was because God existed. But it was not. And in a certain sense, the screen is formless and void right now. There is no slide up there. We have that same sort of thing. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light was good. And he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. So the first thing we see is void. We kind of see nothingness. And then immediately following that, light. A canvas, so to speak, that when we finally shed some light on the screen, for example, it creates a space of potential. We've got, in this case now, a blank screen as opposed to perhaps a void screen. And human beings have been using that idea of a big blank white canvas, so to speak, for a very long time. And in most cases, at least within the Western tradition, we start with a white rectangle. Paper, canvases, panels, you name it. We typically will start with a wide rectangle. It's inherited from Greeks in many ways and their insistence on balance and symmetry, and it's very easy to say you begin with a somewhat balanced composition when you have 4 lines, 2 horizontal and 2 vertical, distances apart and parallel with one another. So people have begun with this idea for a very long time. And every painting that you've ever seen, any drawing that you've ever seen, or a large amount of them, are just different versions of this. That's where we begin. Now, drawing, we came in, we were kind of thinking about normal things. Who in here would, by show of hands, say, yeah, I'm pretty good at drawing. I mean, I can get the job done. There's one person there. Who would say, okay, the other end of the spectrum, the people that are like, no, dude, not even a stick figure, like, brutal. A lot of you guys. And in engineering school. That's incredible. Well, it's going to be difficult to pick. I was hoping there would only be 1 or 2. I'm going to ask my mother's former student, studied theology. I'm going to get you to do the drawing. I mean, you volunteered. I'm just very simple instructions. Okay. Don't go on your iPad. Okay. Like on the front there. And I start all my drawing classes at Trinity with this. This is where we start drawing class. So all I want you to do is, from near the center of the left-hand edge, starting on the edge, near the center of the left-hand edge, the center point of the left-hand edge, draw a horizontal line directly across the page to the center of the right-hand edge, as clear as possible. Okay. All right.
Good job, Daniel. You made my best work, right?
You're walking right into my trap. I love it. Yeah, so Daniel, here's your drawing. It's a simple drawing. I think we could all agree. I've created a representation of your drawing before you drew it. Imagine that. You followed an instruction and you came up with a pretty good drawing here. I liked that in a certain sense, you begin with this blank canvas and you make a mark across it. And interestingly, the next thing that we read in Scripture is there's an expanse between the waters to separate the water. So God made the expanse and separated the water. And this is where we get our first, sort of very direct spatial metaphor. Under the expanse from the water, over the expanse. And if we go down, when you drew that line, what you created was an over and an under. Now, before you started, we didn't have an over and an under, did we? We just had this. When you draw that line, we have an over and under. Incidentally, we have the over and under because you've also created 2 rectangles and a line. And you've also added a whole new color to the piece of paper. So now we have, instead of just white, we have white and black, we have a horizontal line, and we have 2 rectangles. This is what we got from you drawing the line across paper. Oh, and we also got over and under. So we've got something going on there. Where am I? Oh. Sorry, that was a little hiccup. We also got up and down. It's another way of describing over and under, but it's also distinct from what we mean when we say over and under. We also got high and low. Now values begin to enter into it in a certain sense, because we can have high temperatures and low temperatures. And indeed, when we look at a thermostat, we put the warmer ones on the top and the colder ones on the bottom. We've got a top and a bottom. In this case, we start to describe one of those lines that was originally there, but it facilitates our discussing it because we now have that top and the bottom. And then this is when it starts to get fun. Well, and a lot of times, if you show someone this and you say, what is this? What does this mean? They might say, well, it looks like a horizon line. So that line that you drew can be a horizon. And if it's a horizon, then that creates sky and land, or sky and water. Some kind of, division. We would call that an icon. It's actually depicting something that's out there in the real world that we can see. You've got then associations with those things, heaven and earth. Where do winners go? Yeah, they go on top. We all know that. And losers go down below. So when we draw a single line on a piece of paper, we create a whole lot of meaning that wasn't there before we drew the line on a piece of paper. And you can't draw. I mean, look what you did. You created this really dynamic relationship on this piece of paper between the top and the bottom. You created the potential of a horizon line. You've done a whole lot of things, and you did it in a unique way. In fact, it's a slight curve. It's irregular. We call it an irregular curve. It's nice. Back up. So, you start a drawing class like that to try to convince students that no matter what you try to depict, you're going into an already meaningful universe. You're going, the blank slate, the thing that you think is very neutral, is pregnant with it. And by doing something as simple as drawing a horizontal line, it explodes with ideas and meaningful imagery right off the bat. It's important to think about that, I think, because we oftentimes want to think about meaning as something that happens on down the line, or when we finish, or as an end game. So when a student says, how do you create meaning in your work? It means, how do you put all these things together, or go about applying your trade or whatever, and end up with something meaningful? As if it weren't simply a matter of beginning with what's meaningful, and seeking to understand it, dividing it up, creating relationships, etc. The artist Mel Bachner, conceptual artist active in the 1960s and the 1970s, he did a whole body of work on this. And this is the type of work that when you walk into a museum, this is chalk on a floor. When you walk into a museum, it's very easy to scoff at this simple type of idea. But in its simplicity is its profundity, that what Mel Bachner is doing is in the middle of a space, an art museum. He's simply trying to make you pay attention to the fact that some things are inside this circle, some things are outside this circle, and some things can be on this circle. Even using a circle, I think, is interesting. Everything outside of that circle is outside of that circle, on the face of the earth, and it creates a hot spot when that's done very deliberately, and you put it in the middle. And I think it's an important way of just thinking about, reminder that we live and move and have our being in time-space. We also live and move and have our being in Christ, but we live and move and have our being in time-space, where lines and delineations and very simple gestures, like a line across a piece of paper, matter, and they make a significant amount of difference in the way that we think. Let's see here. So I like to think of this line to begin with as that line of the horizon that's created when God separates the waters under the earth from the water below the earth. And he continues to divide. He continues to make lines, so to speak. He continues to divide into realms. He continues to delineate amongst rulers. He continues to do this over and over and over and over again, until he gets to the human being and he says, I'm going to create man in my image. He then commands the human to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. And the idea of the human being a reflection of God, if we do the formal analysis, the human being then, as someone that just as God, out of the chaos of the void, creates light, a greater degree of order, and just out of the chaos of light, creates a horizon, a greater degree of order. He creates further and further and further complexities by dividing, by drawing lines, and by making one thing distinct from the other thing, because that's what you do when you draw that on the paper. You make the top distinct from the bottom. And those distinctions, as they go on and on and on and on, give birth to all the incredible magnificence and beauty of creation that the psalmist is recognizing in Psalm 8. Shalom, it's universal flourishing and delight. It's the way that things are supposed to be. It's, I am an ordering God. I'm a beauty-creating God. And I create you, and I say to you creatures, your job is to do as I do. And here's your place to do it. It's like a sandbox in a certain sense. Imagine maybe the perfect world. I think one analogy would be a sandbox. And all us artists and engineers just get super excited because the world's a sandbox, and God says, don't play with a red bulldozer. There's this incomprehensible happiness resting on an incomprehensible condition, as G.K. Chesterton said. So it's not to say that that has remained perfect. And I just want to briefly touch on the problem. We've got work and worship really being combined with one another. God places the man in the garden to work the ground in Genesis 2. And the word abat in Hebrew is the same word that Joshua uses, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. To serve, to worship, to work, these things are an interchangeable idea. They are one and the same in a certain respect, that the world as it was meant to be knew no distinction between that being, living, reflecting, worshiping, and glorifying God, and working. There's a harmony that we appreciate with God. There's a harmony that we appreciate with the earth, harmony we appreciate with ourselves, and harmony we appreciate with others. I want to point those things out because while I'm trying to paint a sort of ideal picture for what the world might be like, the truth is that these harmonies are broken. And an analogy I've used many times, and I decided to use my little line, and we'll plop a little 4 more lines down in the middle of our horizontal line, and this is a sort of reverse engineered metaphor using G.K. Chesterton. But to imagine God as a shipbuilder, and he's built this incredible vessel, and he has brought us on board essentially to sail this vessel with him. And the stipulation is that we would sail the vessel as he's asked us to do it, that we would do it as he's asked us to do it. And we mutiny, essentially. We mutiny, and we say that we would like to go our own way. We kick the captain off the ship, so to speak. We wrest the controls away from him, as he has given us the freedom to do, in a certain sense. And what we end up with, of course, is this broken line. Shalom falls apart. The harmony of that ship, all of a sudden we realize that there are consequences to our control of the ship, namely that we don't actually know how to do it, and we certainly can't do it on our own. We have that ship falling apart. We experience that as pain. He says to the man, by the sweat of your brow you will bring up. He says, what was once a joyful work will now be understood as toil. By the sweat of your brow you'll bring up fruit from the earth. In fact, it gets even worse than that. That soil that you're milling, I made that soil. I made you out of that soil. And it's to that soil that you're going to return. The life that we enjoyed was broken. We encounter isolation, that we hide from God. Where are you? I was naked. You're not naked. You're naked because you're not comfortable in your own skin. I do love that, they create the leaves for themselves, and one of God's final acts is the creation of better clothing technology, essentially. He says, you're doing it wrong. Let me make it out of skin. So, introduction into that shalom, we have the pain, isolation, and toil, and in a certain sense, just going to represent that by a break. It's just broken. It's not the way that it's supposed to be. Why sometimes things aren't showing up? There we go. I didn't mean to put presenter things on that. Isaiah 58, verse 12, and this is a beautiful little poetic description of what is going to happen as the writer's writing. He says, your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and raise up the age-old foundation. You will be called the repairer of the breach, in all capitals, clearly a reference to the Messiah, the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets with dwellings. It's a Christ hymn, I think, in a certain sense. It's a looking forward to the coming of the Christ. But that this is sort of the context within which it's left. There is a breach that needs restoring. There's a gap that needs restoring. And of course, at an engineering school, how do we restore a gap? We build a bridge. We go about making a bridge. What do you think of my bridge? I don't think it's a very good bridge, actually. But I used the 4 pieces of the broken ship that I had, and I put them back together. G.K. Chesterton describes this, and the way he takes the ship metaphor is describing the voyage of Robinson Crusoe, where this young boy is shipwrecked, and he basically washes up onto a deserted island with only himself and the wreckage of what was once a mighty ship. And the first thing that he does is make an inventory. And Chesterton describes it. The inventory is the most exciting thing in the world. Well, the inventory is entirely filled with broken things and displaced things and out-of-place things. It's candlesticks and whatever has been salvaged from the wreckage of this once magnificent ship. And what has Robinson Crusoe said about doing? Rebuilding civilization using its wreckage. And in a certain sense, this is what we have to work with, of the world that was once that perfect world we've described. And so we go about rebuilding its wreckage. And we do it both in metaphorical ways and in real ways. We really do build bridges to repair breaches, to span depths. You know, bridge, pump. The root word for bridge is the same as the root word for pontiff. For pontifex is a bridge builder. The pontiff, of course, the royal pontiff is the Pope. The Pope, of course, is the mediator between God and man. Christ is the mediator between God and man, the great high priest that's bridging that gap that we've created. So we use the word bridge as a way of describing that connection between ourselves and God, the reconnection between that things. Has anyone ever seen the 4 spiritual laws? How do you bridge the gap? The cross, you take those 2 long pieces and you put them together, and of course that's the best way to bridge that gap. This is what the 4 spiritual laws says. And indeed, it is true, clearly, but it's not, I don't think, the best way to build a bridge, is it? Would be maybe thinking about it, what I did in this case is, that center pylon up and basically creating a suspension bridge off of that original one to give that long centerpiece a little bit of support along the way, so that it's not, because in my original bridge it's just supporting all the way across. So I'm just making up bridge building right now, and you guys can critique me gladly, or we can workshop a better bridge design with those 4 pieces. And there's a foundation, and I think this is a very important thing too. That idea, you have to be able to drive that piling deep into something. That the thing that enables us to sort of begin to see the world as it's broken and begin devising ways of improving that world and bringing about more redeeming images is that we have to be rooted. Essentially, the cross is still at the center of this bridge that I've created there. Rooted in the reality of the one who has actually remade the world in one instance, and that instance being the resurrection. That in the resurrected body of Christ, we have this very real instance of the first fruit of a new creation, the first fruit of a way that things might be remade. And so we do, as people, go about trying to improve the world that we live in. We do go about bringing further order out of chaos. Sometimes we build bridges because we need to, and sometimes we build bridges just because we'd like to get across that wrinkle in the earth a little bit more quickly or more efficiently, or move some other thing across, or because we want to transport some other thing, in this case an aqueduct transporting water. And in this case, I love the arch. You've got this form. We were driving by Mr. Letourneau's giant, beautiful structures today, and what I noticed at first is, of course, they're wonderful structures because they're just like an arch spun in 360 degrees, it's got to be the strongest building in the world in a certain. So there'd be this. I love the shape of it. It suggests stability. You know what I'm talking about, right? The big loose. You've got the arch there, and we make even better arches. We get new materials that enable us to. New materials, steel, etc., that enable us to do even more interesting things with a bridge. We can span longer distances. We can create, out of our understanding of the materials that we're working with, we can innovate further and further and further. A cantilever span, just a different way of doing it. This is a bridge that I made. One of the first things I did when I got to graduate school was build a bridge and modeled it after the New River Canyon Gorge. But at the time I was subsisting on Chinese food almost entirely, and I became enamored with the chopstick. Every day I would get chopsticks just because it's more fun, and I would eat with them, and I would throw them away, and I'm eating with chopsticks and throwing them away, eating and throwing them away. But you spend enough time with a chopstick and you start to realize, okay, here's a readily available 7-inch long piece. It's a stick, it's a rod, it's a rigid form, and so what can you do with like these little rigid forms? And I start to imagine about bridges. Why are bridges made? Rail bridges and things like that. I think about my own connection with the Chinese community in New Orleans. I think about the construction of bridges in the West, going west in the trains and things like that, and the people whose backs those bridges were built on, etc. So I'm playing around with the bridge as a connector, but then I'm bringing into it this other imagery from a different angle, I suppose. And by creating it out of a different material, then it's in the material itself that it draws a lot of its meaning. So then the question again, how do you create meaning in your art? Well, you draw a line. That's the first place to start. Where you create meaning in engineering, you understand, I think in a certain sense, how does God's world work? The one that He created. What are the nuts and bolts of it? How do you glorify God with your engineering? Understand what God did. Begin with those nuts and bolts. It's a very important thing because you can draw more lines. So you have that one line and you begin to add lines, and in a certain sense you can add them arbitrarily and you start to create patterns and things like that. A few additional circles here, a few additional circles there. Just then it looked like a movie reel to me, and I hadn't really thought of it in that way before. Put a circle in the center and remove some of those, and suddenly it's starting to look like this rosette window in a Gothic cathedral. Now I can assure you that while I may have been sort of doing the math backwards and coming up with this little diagram, it was not my intention when I came to this particular thing. And it's because this particular thing began with a very different drawing. It was a drawing that was a little bit more like this, and then was developed into a drawing like this. And that drawing was motivated by a flight over the Queensboro Bridge, of which you saw a little image of a second ago, a cantilever span bridge. And at a certain altitude, the long, long, long stretch of the Queensboro Bridge looks like you could just scoop it up and click it together as if it were a seatbelt. And I started thinking, what is a bridge that connects back onto itself? And that's where it sort of begins, is with a question, a dumb question in one sense. It's just a question that pops into a human being's mind, and the human being begins to then explore that question with the assumption that what they're going to come up with is meaning. Because there's meaning in the earth, because there's meaning in materials, because there's meaning in matter and shapes and lines across a paper. If a line across a paper can mean anything, can mean something really interesting, then I figured that a looping arch span bridge connected to itself could also mean something. Do I know what that means? No. Do I know who authored its meaning? Yes. And so I proceed in that way. So there's that drawing, and then there's the refined drawing. And then there's more drawing, only in this case it's drawing with a router. It's gouging out plywood halves. And then there's drawing with these rigid pieces of 1/8 inch by 1/2 inch steel angle and steel flat, and cutting them 900 little pieces to all these varying little lengths. There's making that half, and then there's making multiple halves, and then you end up with that vision in the flesh. This is 10 feet in diameter, it's all straight lines, it's all put together from just little pieces of 1/8" steel, tacked together for the most part, tack welded together, not anything really significant. Draws its strength just from the sheer number of little welds that you have. Divides into sections to make it bolts together to make it easier to transport, things like that. But so you arrive at this from the sort of whim of a question of what would it look like, or what would it mean if I attach this thing together. But we don't make bridges like that, because bridges connect one thing to another. So you begin to think about it. What I found interesting was the wheel within the wheel, not only the rosette window which emerged, but the wheel within the wheel, the way that these points sort of connect together and they create an implied circle within the larger circle. And when thinking about an implied circle within a larger circle, the image, the prophetic image of the wheel, the vision of the wheel within the wheel comes to mind. And did I mention I was a bike mechanic? There is a wheel within a wheel. It's called a hub, and that's what it looks like. You've got an axle, you've got bearings, you've got the hub body and hub flange, and then you've got the perforations for the spokes to go through. Essentially, that's what a wheel within a wheel looks like, and then it's holding in tension the outer wheel with these straight spokes. But to think about a hub is interesting because every wheel's got that wheel in the middle of the wheel in a certain sense. And then to think of it as a metaphor, this looks a lot like the wheel within the wheel. It looks a little bit like a hub of sorts. And this is our sort of description, the way that we've chosen to draw and try to understand the way that an atom works. But there's an interesting thing about the atom. The atom is composed of other smaller parts. There are lots of little parts that make up the atom. And when you take those little parts, say, one hub's got 8 valence bearings and one hub's got X number of valence bearings, kind of playing around, mushing the language up a little bit. But the idea is that as you give and take from those in very small increments, you profoundly change the properties of the atom. Little this, that, changing a number here, changing a number there, and you've got fundamentally different materials. You then begin to combine those into the mind-boggling number of permutations that are possible because they relate to one another. And you've got the difference between high tensile steel and chromoly steel, and you can do all sorts of things. And by tweaking those little bearings at the center of what makes everything, you can end up with the same material but with different properties that make it useful for different sorts of things. And we just sort of keep digging deeper and deeper. And they do actually make a machine to try to get at what's in the middle of those things and those protons. And this is the Tevatron Super Collider. It was just outside of Chicago where I just lived. It wasn't far from where we worked. And you know what this wheel does? It's like a circular bridge. It just keeps it going and going and going and going and going faster and faster and faster and faster until it runs it into itself or explodes it. And then you get shapes like this. The way that these things are represented and printed out is the way that the sensors are recognizing what's actually coming off of those exploded, disintegrated particles. And they try to look at these new drawings, and they study and they figure out and they discern what actually is making up the building blocks of our world. And what's interesting about that then is you've come really kind of full circle from the raw material of a line and that line's repetition and its permutations. And if you keep following that trail, what you end up with are the very fingerprints of God. And that is why I do believe that for an artist, someone says, how do you make meaning in your work? How do you create meaning in your work? I dig a hole anywhere. I dig into God's green earth in some way, and what you pull up is going to be meaningful because God said it was good. That was meaningful. And interesting, at an engineering school, the question that's on the students' minds was not, how did you make this or how did you make that? It was, how do you create meaning in your work? And I think it's because sometimes it can be difficult for the artist or the engineer to feel like there is something really meaningful in it. The engineer has I think the advantage of practicality, and back to the sort of hoeing a line in the ground. I love that, bulldozers, earth moving equipment. I noticed something out there that looked like it was possibly some kind of plow. I don't know, that Mr. Letourneau made. The plow is an interesting thing because one of those things that we discussed that makes it difficult to do this work that we've been set to do is that we are always pushing into material that's resisting. And Gene Peterson calls that progress. When the progress is always moving into resisting material. But when God brings down the curse on the soil and he says, by the sweat of your brow, that you'll bring up fruit from this. When he introduces to work this worshipful idea, the idea of toil, human beings begin a project. And that project is called, how do we make hoeing rows and bringing up fruit from the ground less toilsome? And one of the first inventions was some kind of, maybe it was a stone, maybe it was metal, but some kind of like back-to-back inclined planes that if you put them in the ground and you attach them to a couple of animals by these things called yokes that our Lord would then use later on as a metaphor for all sorts of spiritual things, and the oxen move through the ground, the plow digs in, and it furrows the row that you are having to do with the work of your own back. And you're not feeling quite as toilsome anymore. And the world is redeemed. There's some progress away from the curse of the garden. And then you learn how to do it, but you can do it a lot faster and a lot quicker, but you also have to burn fossil fuels while you're doing it. So there's always a seeing through the glass dimly, so to speak. But the reason I use that drawing, and the reason why I start like this with art students, is to say, your purpose as an artist, the thing that orients you, is really, in a certain sense, summed up in your ability to draw this horizontal line and then recognize what it means about God's world. And the moment that you do that, your vocation, you being an art major, your calling, you're standing before God as far as who you are and your purpose on this world is fulfilled. That you're okay from that point. You don't have to doubt your existence. And you don't have to, in a certain sense, I gotta create meaning out of this. I can't just, plow rows in the soil. I have to make it somehow more than it is. And I think what this says, what Scripture says, the way the Genesis narrative plays itself out is that what it communicates is that it's vitally meaningful from the very beginning. We don't stop there, of course. We continue to tease, we continue to divide, we continue to make new things, and we continue to innovate. But we do it with that knowledge of where it comes from. We do it from a foundation that says it's good right off the bat. We don't have to sort of add external justification, and I know, at least engineers have the advantage of making things that do actual things. Art majors are stuck with, I make things that don't actually do anything. There's pure impracticality in some respects. And my wife would attest to that. Our garage is full of purely impractical, wonderful objects. But they are purely impractical. So that's kind of sums up the main thrust of the remarks that I wanted to make. And where we go from there, as an artist, as an engineer, this is when we begin to differentiate. As a writer, the stuff that you make it out of is different than an accountant. Tills the soil of numbers, and it's a glorious and magical balancing act that I have no compulsion or draw toward. But it's a neat thing. It's a neat thing. Are there any questions that you guys have, or comments, or suggestions on how to build a beverage out of those 4 lines?
Just one thing that caught my eye, I was a little curious about when you had your never-ending bridge. hung on display, how long did it take you to get the lighting? It looked like you didn't mention that was perhaps very intentional, how you did the shadows. Is that true, or was that?
It was very simple. I mean, you just simply set it off from the wall a certain distance and put the lights coming from the side so that the shadow that from here intersects with the shadow there. But I wasn't really trying to. What happens, because the shadow's a material visual thing, is that if you make the shadow, you can really probably sculpt the shadow, you can play with it, and you could accomplish maybe something really unique with the shadow, but the moment that you do that, it becomes a part of the visual information of the whole. And I really just wasn't worried. I wasn't interested in adding something to it yet, I guess, you know. I've subsequently installed it in different contexts and places where I have thought about, okay, how is the environment affecting this now? The sort of lie of the white cube gallery being this kind of neutral space where it lets the object stand autonomously from everything else in the world, provides a space where I just wanted to kind of have it as an object. One of the things that students brought up last night, I don't know how the conversation, I did a little quick primer in art history, I guess, painting, the history of painting, and photography and how it affected it. And we started talking about art as an object, and that one thing that artists that started creating the types of paintings that a lot of people don't like big color-filled paintings or things that don't show sort of a hand, is that they stopped using the canvas as a window into another world. They stopped framing it. It was no longer a flat space referring to something other than itself. It started being its own thing in space. And so this morning, Aaron was coming over to get me for breakfast, and he's just kind of kicking around the apartment and wanting to give me a hard time. And he says, you know, Dayton, if you want to get some work done, or I can't remember how you put it, you're like, there's a inspirational chicken soup for the soul inspirational word search over here. And if you want to search for some words, you could do that. And we joked, and I told him I'd already done it, of course. But I said, but there is something interesting about that, because of course, when we're doing a word search, we're presented with something that looks, for all intents, kind of formless and void. There's a chaos in the midst of it. And we start to connect these things into lines, and they begin to create a sort of configuration. And I kind of started in that way, and I think he picked the book back up, and he flips it open, to this. Inspiration number 47. This is your inspiration for the day. Everyone wants to understand painting. Why don't they try to understand the singing of birds? People love the night, a flower, everything that surrounds them without trying to understand them. But painting, they must understand. Pablo Picasso. I was like, there you go. Order out of chaos. A little bit of that chicken soup for the soul, for real. But it's a good point. It was a very conversation we were having with students last night. Was that, you know, yeah, it is a giant red rectangle, but isn't red interesting? You know, there's radiation everywhere, of all different sorts. And there's this one particular wavelength of radiation that we think of as visible light, and that's because, you know, this is what our eyes have been designed to perceive. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's this tiny little band, and in that tiny little band, these infinitely small variations in wavelength. We see red, green, blue, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. I just messed up Roy Bit. I can't do that. I'm a professor of art for crying out loud. I teach two-dimensional design. You know, that what we talk about when we talk about the things that we see, it's just this tiny little sliver of a vast continuum, and so the color red is a pretty doggone special thing. And oxidized Corten steel, that color is a pretty darn special thing. Not to mention Corten steel itself. These are all very, very special things, worth paying attention to in their own right, both for their practical usefulness and for their metaphorical usefulness, for the ways that they can be configured and allow us to do different things. And that's where meaning begins in engineering and in art, is with materials. And that's why I started describing these things as, sticks with animal hair stuck on the end of them. This is an important thing to recognize, that there's meaning in that before you begin to paint a picture of a tree or Jesus or whatever it is that you decide to paint. Comments, anything else?
Let's do this. Our time, thank you. First of all, maybe we can give a round of applause.